Okay, good evening. So, we are going to be studying the third chapter of the book of Daniel, and just to plug you into the story, let me tell you what happened. I know some of you were watching it on YouTube, but still, it would be good to just get into it. Okay, here it is. So, Freud. What was the point of Sigmund Freud? Sigmund Freud came up with a scientific theory which says that there is a mode of thought that happens at night while we're sleeping. It's called dreaming. And the dreams we have are not just haphazard pieces of information, but rather they're rich with meaning, right? That's the idea of Sigmund Freud. And he wrote a pretty good book called The Interpretation of Dreams, which if you want to read any of Freud's books, I would say that's probably the best one. Because he actually goes into detail as to the symbolic meaning of particular dream content. So I like that. But the idea that dreams have meaning is actually a very ancient one. And we see that Nebuchadnezzar wakes up, he has this nightmare. It terrifies him precisely because he's aware of the fact that the dream is giving him a message. And the message is a very scary one. Now, do you remember when he had the dream? The dream happens before he turns Babylonia into an empire, right? So at this point, Babylonia is a regional power. They're out there conquering different nations, but they still didn't capture the land of Israel. And you remember what I said about the land of Israel? That the land of Israel is the bridge. From this bridge, we get empires, right? That's what we said. So we said that was back then in the ancient days, Beruchim Abbaim, back then in the ancient days, if you would conquer Israel, Israel is that bridge that connects Africa together with Asia. So emperors always looking to conquer Israel. Today, I told you that Israel is going to play a very significant role in the future unfolding of history. Right? It's not going to be history, because it's going to be the future, but Israel is going to play a very significant role because we see that on the one hand you have the United States, which is allied with the European powers. On the other hand, you have Russia, which is beginning to ally itself with Iran, with China, right? And there's going to be this attempt by both sides to push the other side forward. So now the America trying to push Russia forward by taking over Ukraine through NATO, and Russia saying, no, we won't do it. So you see that struggle taking place, and it may unfold into a world war. Who knows whether it will. But the key to the Western world's pushing back this alliance between Russia, China, and Iran is Israel. So today, Israel, oddly enough, plays the same role that it played back then. If you control Israel, you have the key to empire building, or in this case, preventing your rival in the east from pushing towards Europe. So he sees this dream. Let's get back to the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. He sees the dream, and the dream depicts an idol. And the idol is made out of different material. And he sees a stone, and the stone comes out of the mountain, and it's very small and insignificant, but it exploits the divisions within the idol. And what happens? Eventually the stone hits the idol, and the entire idol collapses. So what was the weakness of the idol? The weakness of the idol was the fact that it's different material. Gold is wonderful, but it's only on the top, and it's silver. So you're trying to weld gold together with silver. How are you going to weld it together? And then you have silver, then you have copper. So silver and copper, again, they don't weld together well. But the worst part was the feet of the idol. You had iron with clay, and we begun to discuss the symbolism of that. The European nations coming out of the Roman Empire. We'll talk more about that in the future chapters. We're going to go into great depth as to the meaning of that. But the point is, the stone exploits this division, right? There's a certain division, and Nebuchadnezzar understands that the dream is real. He is fearful of what's going to happen, but he goes on in his life, and what do you think he does? Years pass. He conquers Israel, he conquers Yerushalayim, he destroys the Bet HaMikdash, he exiles the Jewish people into Babylonia. From Israel, he conquers Egypt, and then he conquers some of the adjoining nations there, and he builds an empire. So he builds an empire. He's in a different place now. The story we are going to read tonight takes place about 15 years after the dream. So again, before the dream, when he had the dream, regular king, he's now an emperor. Okay? Now, this whole time, what does Ahasuerus do after he builds his empire? Do you remember? What does he do? He does a great party. So he does this party to celebrate the empire, right? That's Ahasuerus. Okay. What does Nebuchadnezzar do now that he becomes an emperor? He does not throw a party. Okay? We're going to read what he does. So I'm going to read it now, and you are going to hear this, and you're going to see the thinking of Nebuchadnezzar, what he is trying to accomplish. So I have the first pasuk. Unfortunately, I don't have the pages. So here's what I'm going to do. I don't have pages to give out to you. I have the pages for myself. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to read the pasukim carefully. I will interpret them into English, so you will hear the verses. Then I will give my whatever commentary I have in each one of the verses. Does that make sense to you? Right? Second best case scenario, I just give out papers, but I don't have papers. So we'll do the second best scenario, which is I will just read the pasukim, explain them, and you will pay attention, and you will see the story. Nebuchadnezzar Malka, King Nebuchadnezzar, but as I said, he's now an emperor. Avad Selem Didehav. He made a statue, an idol, made of gold. Rumeh Amin Shetin. The height of this idol is 60 amot. 60 amot is 30 yards. So 30-yard idol, pure gold. Petayeh Amin Shit. The width is 6 amot, which is 3 yards. Akimeh Bevikatura. He puts this idol in a place called Bikatura. Bikatura is a large plain where there is a huge amount of space for people to come and congregate. That's important. You will see why soon. Bimtinat Bavel. He puts it in the middle of Babylonia. That's the verse. What is this idol? What does it look like? So again, it's 60 amot high, 6 amot wide. It was shaped like the Washington Monument. Obelisk. It was an obelisk, right? So he builds this obelisk, right? Obelisk looks like a giant column, but with like a pyramid-type structure on top, right? So you're all familiar with the Washington Monument. So he builds this obelisk made out of pure gold. Now, the Torah was written for an intelligent audience. So I want you to think and tell me, what's the connection between this gold obelisk and the dream? And the connection is obvious. Because in the dream, why was the empire weak? The weakness of the empire was because there was different material. There was a lack of unity. There was gold, silver, copper, iron. The bottom was just clay. So there are these opposing forces. What is the antidote to this nightmare? And in Jungian psychologists, if you go to Jungian psychologists, said before, I don't want to say I don't like Sigmund Freud. He was quite brilliant and he contributed quite a lot, but I certainly prefer C.G. Jung. I think C.G. Jung actually had a lot to contribute and actually took Freud's ideas and put them in a different direction, a more favorable direction. So one of the things that Jungian psychologists tell you is they will analyze you, they will look at your dreams, they will psychoanalyze your mind, and they will tell you to perform actions that are opposite to whatever it is that holds you back. So if you're particularly scared of heights, they will teach you eventually, slowly but gradually, how to go to the top of a very high building and just stand there fearlessly, right? And that is to combat whatever particular mental pathology has overtaken that person, right? So Jungian psychology, again, tells you take actions to counteract whatever negative energy you have within you. That's what he's doing. That's what Nebuchadnezzar is doing. The dream, disunity. The dream, there is the possibility of exploiting differences between the material of the idol. The solution, pure gold. Make an idol which is pure gold, the best material. There was no possibility of exploiting anything. You see the idea of Nebuchadnezzar, very intelligent. He wasn't an idiot. People think these dictators, they were not idiots. He was obviously very intelligent, and he had a very clear idea of what he wants to do. So what is going to happen now? This is going to be a celebration of the empire. We said Ahasuerus made a huge party, everybody got drunk, right? It was a party that lasted for months, and then they had a party that lasted for 7 days in Shushan Abirah. Nebuchadnezzar does not want to make a huge party where everybody gets drunk, but rather he wants to have this particular symposium in Bik'at Dura. And let's see what he is going to do now. So he puts the obelisk in the middle of this huge plain, right, a valley, and he is now going to have the following. Nebuchadnezzar ordered that the following gather at the obelisk. Lemichnash, Lachashdar Penaya. First of all, the Ahashdar Penaya have to come. The Ahashdar Penaya are the senators that represent the various provinces in the central government. So you have, for example, in America, you have senators. The senators are in the federal government, but each senator represents, there's 2 senators per state. These 2 senators represent the particular state. So the Ahashdar Penaya were the equivalent of the senators. Signaya. Signaya are the military rulers who are in charge of the horses and chariots. So, for example, in Israel, you have the brigadier general. So what is a brigadier general? The brigadier general is the general who's in charge of like the tanks, right? So here, this is kind of like the brigadier general. There were no tanks back then, but they had horses, they had chariots, so that's a signaya. Ufahavata. Fahavata are the rulers, the military rulers who are in charge of the foot soldiers. So you see he's inviting here the military, all the generals, all the admirals, right? Adar Gazaria. These are the magistrates in charge of law enforcement, similar to the police officers, those in charge of the police. Gedabraya. The Gedabraya are interesting in Babylonia. So in America, you have separation of religion, church, and state, right? So in Babylonia, no. The head of the Babylonian religious cult was appointed by the government, right? In America, you can't do that because it's unconstitutional. You cannot have, the government cannot establish a religion. The government cannot financially support a religion or a religious institution, right? In Babylonia, the people who were appointed by the government as the theological leaders or the administrators of the theological institutions, they were called the Gedabraya. By the way, this gives you a looking glass into the Babylonian system of government, right? It really, it's quite fascinating how the Torah really, it reflects with such precision what actually took place in Babylonia in those days. Really amazing stuff from a historical perspective. The Tabraya were the personal treasurers of the king. The king had a huge expense account, so you know how you have the royal family in England. So how much money did the royal family get? I don't even know, but let's say they have houses and they have mansions and they have each house, I don't know, they have in the houses, they have maids and, is that politically incorrect to say that? Am I supposed to say that? People who are in charge of cleaning up and throwing the garbage and cooking and doing all these other things. Right, so they have a huge budget. I think Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, wow, just what a sad story. You know, so just they're victims. I think they got sent like $30 million a year. I mean, really. They had a Netflix. Did anybody see the Netflix show? You saw it? Really, just so sad. You know, just really, just so. That poor Meghan Markle. You know, the $30 million a year, 40 million. I don't know. Who knows? I mean, yeah. So you saw it. You also thought it was sad. I'm sorry. Yes. No, but so the point being that you see how the royal family. I'll get to you in a moment. They have a budget, right? Till today, they have a budget, right? And they get crazy amounts of money. So these, the Tabraya, they were the ones in charge of allocating the money for the royal family of Nebuchadnezzar, whatever it is that they need. I don't know if they did as well as Meghan Markle did, but they probably did pretty well. I'm assuming, again, yeah.
I'm curious, the definitions that they give the words, where did they get?
Oh, it's not easy, by the way. It's really not easy. I use my father's notes. I use a mefaresh called Rabbi Yosef Yahya, who's an old Sephardi thing. I did some historical research so that I can connect what I'm reading the mefarshim with the actual history of Babylonia. It's not easy. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to get the meaning of these words, just so you know. But it was a few sources that allowed me to derive the meaning of these words. Yeah. No, so the Megillah is Ahashdar Panya, which is exactly the senators representing the various provinces. It's true, right? Because they had to give the letters to all the, every person had to give it to their own province, whoever the province was. Yeah, but you're right. That's the same word. Tefataya, finally, and we're almost at the end of the end of the guest list. All these guests are being invited to this particular symposium. We'll see what the symposium is soon. So there's a huge guest list. I'm sorry, yeah.
Where is this? Is this Babylon?
It's in Babylon. The name of the place was Bik'at Dura. So Bik'at Dura was a huge plain. It was a natural plain because it could be mountains, but no. They want to have a huge plain so that you can gather many, many people there. And the obelisk is going to be in the middle, and all these people are going to be summoned or are being summoned to this place. So the military leadership, the judicial leadership, the theological leadership, the political leadership, those in charge of the finance. Finally, Tiftaya is the intellectual elite, the professors, right? Shiltonei Medinata. Shiltonei Medinata refers to the governors. The governors are the local leaders that are there in the local jurisdictions. That's the end of this list, right? V'chol Shiltonei Medinata. Okay. And what is the instruction? Lemete. Everybody is hereby summoned. Lahanukat Salma. For the consecration of this Selem, the obelisk. The Hakem Nebuchadnezzar Malka, that Nebuchadnezzar has just established. So everybody received an invitation. Anybody who was somebody in the kingdom received this invitation to be present at the consecration of this obelisk. I will explain all that in a moment. It's like, so there was a funeral now of Queen Elizabeth, right? You remember that? Queen Elizabeth, right? So there was somebody received an invitation. So when there's a royal affair, if you're somebody of importance, you receive the invitation, right? So if you're an important person in England, know that you were invited to the funeral of Queen Elizabeth. Anybody who was important was invited to this symposium. And the purpose is for the consecration of this obelisk. Let me explain to you what this means. And one of the first people that wrote about the consecration of idols in antiquity, in pagan religions, was actually my father, alav shalom. And he explained to me what this was about. So you have an idol. And we grow up, we always rightfully poke fun at idolatry, because idolatry is ludicrous. But we think it's ludicrous because we're saying, they're worshiping a particular image. So you make the image, let's say an image of a cat. You make an image of a cat, right, from wood, and then you pray to not us, chas v'shalom, they pray to that image of the cat, okay? And then we poke fun at it and we say, well, you just made that image, so why are you praying to the image of the cat? You just made it. How can you possibly now venerate the image, right? That's the intellectual dissonance that goes on in our mind. But the truth of the matter is it's a little deeper than that. Rambam says, the Gemara says, that if somebody prays to a stone or a piece of wood, and in his mind he thinks the stone or the piece of wood has special powers, that person is a shoteh. He's an idiot. He is not hayaf for doing avodah zarah because the stupidity is so great that he is not of sane mind, and in order to be culpable in Jewish law, by the way, also in America, if you want to be culpable of committing a crime, you have to be of sane mind, right? So here, if you want to be culpable of committing the crime of avodah zarah, you have to be of sane mind. Well, the fact that you believe that the stone or the piece of wood is somehow a god shows that you are not of sane mind, and therefore you would not be culpable, meaning the Bet Din would not be able to perform death penalty on you. That's the idea, right? So what's avodah zarah then? Okay, let me explain that. This is so important. And here is a great chidush. What makes an idol holy? There was a ceremony. The ceremony, the consecratio, Consecratio is literally the consecration ceremony, whereby, let's say I make Egypt, somebody makes an image of a cow, okay? There is a ceremony through which that particular idol now draws in the spirit of the cow god within it, so that before the spirit of the cow god enters that physical image of a cow, the physical image of the cow has no holiness, or tum'ah, let's call it tum'ah, I don't even want to say it, holiness, it has no tum'ah. But once they draw in the image, whatever magical incantations and rituals, every god has its own rituals, right? There's different rituals for different gods. Then that god now resides within that idol. And now when you're worshiping the idol, you're not worshiping the physical idol. Again, I'm talking about the Shitel of the Avodah Zarah, not Chas v'Shalom, we reject this, of course, but I want you to understand the idea, because there's a pasuk in the Torah that says, Lo ta'asun iti Elohe chesed ve'Elohe zahab. What does it mean, lo ta'asun? Don't make. Because they literally would bring this within in their minds, again, according to their mistaken beliefs, they would bring the spirits of the gods to reside within the idols. Now, once the spirit of the god resides within the idol is holy. And because of this, the idol would be treated with special deference. They would bring it, gifts, and they would bring it food. And if there was a war, and the king, for example, he has an idol that he loves, and he realizes that soon the enemy is going to be entering the city, and he's now going to have to escape for his life. So the king is going to run away with his precious objects. One of the objects he would run away with is the idol. And the reason he would run away with the idol is because the idol has within it the spirit of the god. And if now the enemy would come in, what would he do to the idol? He would step on it and throw mud at it and humiliate the god within the idol, right? I'm giving you the psychology of Avodah Zarah, because without the psychology, you can't understand what's happening here in our story, right? So it's an incredible story, but to understand the story fully, you have to understand the idea of consecratio. So is this clear? Does anybody, is this understood? Consecratio. So that's why Avodah Zarah is, and that's the idea of selem, right? The selem of the Avodah Zarah refers to the spirit within, again, in the mind of the idolater. We don't believe in this, of course. This is all nonsense. There are no spirits, and there's no deities, and there's no gods. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Echad. We believe in only one God who created all there is. So, of course, we reject this, but that's Avodah Zarah. And what Nebuchadnezzar is going to be doing here, he is going to have a ceremony known as consecratio. That's going to be the word used here, and the page just turned, is going to be Lahanukat Salma. You see the word Hanukkah? Hanukat Salma, the consecration of the Selem, Dihakem Nebuchadnezzar Malka. Now let me tell you, how is this related to the holiday of Hanukkah? That's also important, as long as the holiday of Hanukkah. It wasn't planned like this. Chapter 3, that's where we are in Daniel, but we are in the holiday of Hanukkah, and the word Hanukkah appears here. What's the relationship between Hanukkah and the idea of consecration in pagan idolatry? That's an important question. Why is Hanukkah called Hanukkah, first of all? What does the word Hanukkah mean? So Hanukkah means the Hanech. The Hanech means to prepare something, to get something ready for its purpose, right? So for example, Hanoch Lana al pi darko, meaning if you have a child, it is an obligation upon you to rear your child properly so that he is ready for adulthood. That's called chinuch, the chinuch of the child, right? So what is the Hanukkah in the case of the Bet HaMikdash? In the Bet HaMikdash, there were kelim, there were holy utensils. And Moshe Rabbeinu would take the Shemen HaMishcha and he would pour the Shemen HaMishcha on the kelim, and in this way, the kelim were now ready to be used in the Mishkan. Okay? Very simple. What happened when the Greeks, the Seleucid Greeks, remember the Greek Empire split into two or four parts actually, the part that was to the northeast of Israel, the Seleucid kingdom, they invaded Israel. It was Antiochus Epiphanes. He hated Judaism. That's an interesting story, why he hated the Jewish nation so much, but he did hate us. And when he entered the Bet HaMikdash, he defiled all of the Bet HaMikdash. All the kelim were defiled. They would bring korbanot. In the Bet HaMikdash, the korbanot were non-pure animals, such as pig, They would slaughter the pig. They brought avodah zarah into the Bet HaMikdash. So the whole Bet HaMikdash was defiled. It was in ruins. It was unusable. Now, when the Hashmonaim took over, they couldn't just enter the Bet HaMikdash. Okay, let's bring korbanot now. Everything was tameh. The Mizbeach was destroyed. I mean, they brought avodah zarah on the Mizbeach. So you couldn't do that. Let me read to you from the book of Maccabees 1, chapter 4. I'm going to read to you what it says, and now you will understand why it's called Hanukkah. And then you'll see the connection, lehavdil ben kodesh lehol, ben hatahor vehatameh, between the kedusha of Am Yisrael and the tum'ah of the Obdei Avodah Zarah. So let me just read to you. This happens on the 25th day of Kislev. 25th day of Kislev is the first day of Hanukkah, right? So the first day of Hanukkah commemorates this specific event. Bishnat Shemona ve'arba'im u'me'ah v'yashkimu ha'boker. They woke up early in the morning after the war. There was a long battle with the Greeks. They kicked the Greeks out of Jerusalem. They kicked the Greeks out of Judea. They woke up early in the morning. They built a new Mizbeach. And now that they built a new Mizbeach, they consecrated the Mizbeach. This was the same day that a few years before the Goyim entered the Bet HaMikdash on the 25th of Kislev. The 25th of Kislev was the day that the Greeks entered the Bet HaMikdash and they destroyed the Mizbeach and they brought on the Mizbeach Avodah Zarah. That same day, and now you know what Kaf Hei Kislev was such a significant day. They viewed it as a miracle that on the same day that the Greeks entered the Bet HaMikdash, that's the day that we finally retook the Bet HaMikdash and we were able to wake up in the morning and bring korbanot on the Mizbeach, right? So, but first we have to do Hanukkah the Mizbeach, clean up the Mizbeach, they rebuilt a new Mizbeach, and they, like Hallelujah Hashem Beshirim, they had singing, kinorot, halilim, musical instruments, and then they have a consecration ceremony for the Mizbeach, lasted 8 days. So Hanukkah, the word Hanukkah means consecration. It's about consecrating the Mizbeach in the Bet HaMikdash. That took place on the 25th day of Kislev. That's why it's called Hanukkah. So for us, the consecration ceremony is to allow the kelim, the holy utensils, to be worthy of being used in the service of God. It is not that God's Spirit, chas v'shalom, enters, but that's blasphemy. But rather, these kelim are now pure, they're beautiful, and they were allocated specially for the avodah in the Bet HaMikdash. And nobody can touch them except for the Kohanim, and nobody can use them except for the services in the Bet HaMikdash. So that's the Hanukkah of the kelim, the preparation of the kelim, and the Hanukkah Mizbeach. That's the idea of Hanukkah. And of course, and this doesn't contradict the story that you know about the 8 days, 8 days of Hanukkah, and the menorah, and all that stuff. This is just an addition. So, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, so this, the story of Hanukkah was during the days of the Greeks. To just give you like a little perspective. So Nebuchadnezzar was the emperor of Babylonia. So the Babylonian Empire lasted about, let's say, 70 years, okay? Then you had the Persian Empire. Give them another 50 to 70 years. Then you had the Greek Empire, Alexander the Great, right? Alexander the Great now, he takes over, he creates the empire he takes over the empire for the Greeks, right? And then when he dies, it splits into 4 parts, right? So I would say this is about 200 years later, more or less. Let's say if we're talking about to the common era, so the Bet HaMikdash was 68, let's say 200 years backwards, about 170 BCE, more or less, about 170, 200 BCE, yeah? And then that kingdom lasted for another 200 years, and then eventually the Bet HaMikdash was destroyed. That was in the days of the Roman Empire. But yeah, so this is going forward from Nebuchadnezzar, let's say about 150 years, 200 years, more or less, yeah. No, so by the way, you remember when Moshe Rabbeinu builds the Mishkan, the consecration ceremony in Perashat Tzav, and then Vayi, Bayom Hashemini, Kara Moshe, that was the 8th day of the consecration ceremony. So they were following the Torah. the same way in the days of Moshe Rabbeinu, the consecration of the Mishkan took place over the course of 8 days. They decided to do it 8 days. You see?
They wouldn't perform korban
Oh no, they did. Because also in the days of Moshe Rabbeinu, during every day of the consecration, they brought korbanot. You remember in Parashat Tzav, it describes the korbanot and how the sons of Aharon, they had to stay within the Mishkan and eat the korban, but it was an 8-day consecration ceremony during which they brought korbanot. Second half of Parashat Tzav describes it. The 8th day is Bayom HaShemini, and now that the Mishkan was consecrated, then they had the Nesi'im brought korbanot on the Mishkan, but that was not the consecration ceremony, that's post-consecration. Understood? Okay. Wow. That's nice that we read this on Hanukkah, huh? All right. I got to tell you, that coffee wasn't so bad. I must have been very desperate for coffee because... Well, no, I'm okay. Oh, man. All right. Just give me a moment. I'm sorry. It was good. The Chaim. All right. All right. Let us continue. So you see what's happening here? This obelisk is going to be consecrated, and it is going to become the national symbol of the Babylonian Empire, representing the eternality of the empire, in so much as gold is perfectly unified, and it is going to represent the prominence of Babylonian. Gold is the most expensive material. All right? Let us read the next pasuk. Bedain mitkaneshin, ahash dar penaya. And you're right. I just read this pasuk, so now let us read the next pasuk. Sorry. Right. So they all gather, right, for the ceremony, and it says vekayemin, and they stood there, la kovel salma, and they faced the obelisk, the Hakem Nebuchadnezzar, that Nebuchadnezzar set up. So they were standing face to face with the obelisk, right? That was set up by Nebuchadnezzar. Does this remind anybody? Again, just think of Jungian dream interpretation, or rather the Jungian approach to dealing with particular mental pathologies. You remember what happened in the dream? So you remember when he had the dream, the idol was facing Nebuchadnezzar. Remember that? And it was terrifying him. It was like looking at him. In this scenario, the antidote to the dream, everybody is standing there facing the obelisk, right? Meaning, we're not afraid, we're here, and we mean business, right? So that's the symbolism of what Nebuchadnezzar is setting up by bringing everybody here, the entire Babylonian, all of the people of prominence in Babylonia. And then it was time for the herald to talk with a loud voice, right? Because there was no microphones back then. We are now giving instructions to every am. Amemaya is Aramaic for am. All the amim. I'll explain what that means. Umaya. Umaya is all the ummot. Velishanaya. All the leshonot. So am, what is the word am? Am refers to an ethnic group, a nation, because you have different ethnicities, right? So Amemaya means all ethnicities in the empire. Umaya. Umaya is political entities. Ummah is a political entity. So for example, you have in Parashat Toledot, Ul'om, Mil'om, Ye'emas, V'rav Yahut Za'ir, Le'om, Le'om, Ummah. That refers to the fact that Yaakov is going to establish one political entity and Esav is going to establish the next political entity, and there's going to be constant struggle and fighting between the nations, right? So that's Umaya. And finally, the Lishanaya. Lishanaya refers to linguistic categories, different languages, right? Because the empire was huge, there was people who identified as, we are those who speak Persian, we are those who speak the Median language, whatever the languages are. And there are those, no, we identify with a particular ethnicity, or we identify with a particular nationality. Everybody in the empire, the instruction is as follows. Be'idana. At the time, Di tishme'un kal karna, you are going to hear the sound of the trumpets. Mashrokita, katros, these are different musical instruments. Katros is like the word guitar, katros, guitar, right? It's a string instrument, right? Sabecha is a type of harp, another string instrument. Pesanterin is a triangular shaped harp. I don't know what it's called in English. I don't know the names of these particular instruments. But there's an entire orchestra. So the Babylonian national, what would you call it? Symphony, right? Everybody is there. The whole Sumponeya. Sumponeya sounds like the word symphony, right? That's actually, it's a type of organ, right? Bechol, zene, zemara, and various types of musical instruments. There is going to be a moment. Everybody's going to be standing there, right? They're all standing there now, I'm sorry. Everybody now is going to hear the beautiful music coming out from this orchestra. And when you hear this music, tipelun, you must fall down on your faces. You know how we do on Yom Kippur? Where they say, so we all fall down, because in the Beit HaMikdash, when they would hear the name of God, they would fall on their faces out of reverence. Again, here they're falling down in reverence of Avodah Zarah. So he says, Tipelun, you will all fall down, Vetisgedun, and you will all worship Leselim Dahaba, this golden idol, the Hakem, Nebuchadnezzar Malkah, that Nebuchadnezzar has set up. So now you understand why they're here? So they're going to be a public holiday, a public worship of this idol. And I perhaps may have mentioned this at the beginning, but I didn't. Whose face do you think was on the top of the idol? Just take a guess. I heard a laugh, I heard a chuckle. Whose face do you think was at the top? It was actually Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar's face is at the top. I want to talk about that in a moment, but you understand the idea here of pomp and pageantry and the beauty of the orchestra and all the government officials dressed in their weird clothing, whatever. I mean, you see that in England a lot as well, right? So everybody is there, and there's a tremendous overwhelming feeling, of brotherhood and unity, and they're all going to participate in this national worship of this idol. But unity is not enough. Unity is great. We love talking about unity. That's great. We love talking about democracy. Democracy is something that we talk about a lot, right? Especially in this country, even though America is not really supposed to be a democracy. It's supposed to be a republic, but that's something that's intellectually beyond the capacity of most citizens in this country. So we'll call it a democracy. So tyrants love talking about the equality between people. That's a beautiful theme. They all talk about we're all equal. But if you don't buy into what the tyrant is telling you, there is always going to be the threat of violence. So here Nebuchadnezzar is saying, we're all equal. Everybody is here. Everybody's going to be worshiping the idol together. We're all going to enjoy this beautiful music. We're all going to be privileged to do Avodah Zarah. But if you don't do it, there is a threat of violence. So here comes the next pasuk. So important. If you are not willing to bow down to this idol, because listen, there was different religious denominations in the kingdom. Some people believed in the God of this and the God of that and the God of the other, right? If you're not willing to bow down and to worship this idol, at that moment, you will immediately be thrown into a pit of fire. But this is archaeologically, we know that ancient Babylonia used to seem to enjoy burning people alive. That seems to have been a preferable way of executing people. I don't think they came to the person the night before and they said, what would you like for your last meal? I don't think that was the way it's done. My guess is that they probably just threw them into the pit of fire without necessarily asking them what they want for the last meal. But why go to Babylonia? This was very common in antiquity. You know where it was common to burn people alive? It was common among the Catholics, a religion of love, brotherly love, true love. Unlike the Jewish people who don't represent love, the Catholics represent love. So when they came to America, they used to have a custom of burning, they would burn the Indians, of course, but they would burn 13 Indians at a time. Why 13? Anybody know? You have 12 apostles, and then you have the God of love, right? So they would burn them together. So this is a very common way to kill people in antiquity, very horrifying. For those of you who may remember ISIS and the way they used to, sometimes they would behead people, sometimes they would burn people alive. It's very, very cruel. I didn't have any personal experience with it, and I hope never to have experience with that, but I'm told that it's very, very painful as well. So auto da fe is when they would burn people and books, and in the Inquisition in the Inquisition they used to burn people alive, and the Roman Empire burned people alive. So this is common form of killing people, and in Babylonia, as I said, this was common. So the threat of violence is fundamental to every tyrant. They always speak nicely, right? You go to Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada, he'll speak very nicely. He has a good tailor for his suits. I called him up the other day. He didn't want to tell me who his tailor was, so I just had to go to the garage. What is the place in Stillwell Avenue instead? I bought the suits there. Okay, it didn't work out. He has beautiful suits. He has a beautiful tie. He has a good hairstyle, right? And he speaks very nicely. But if you don't follow his ways, he'll close down your bank account and you won't be able to buy food for your children, right? I mean, that's just the way it works, right? So you see the way the tyrants work? Oh, we believe in brotherhood and equality for everybody. You go to a doctor today in Canada. I have my wrist is hurting. Can you recommend something? Well, yeah, we have what's a new treatment. It's called assisted suicide. Would you like to try that? Yes, highly recommended, assisted suicide. So this is the way of the tyrants. The tyrants speak beautifully, very eloquent. They might have a slight British accent. I guess Trudeau, what type of accent is he? Maybe it's a little French. You know what I'm saying? But there's always that nice element. For a gentleman, a true gentleman, you can tell from his accent, but just try to go against him. There is the threat of violence. Nebuchadnezzar is bringing everybody here. Beautiful orchestra. But if you don't want to bow down to my idol, we will kill you by burning you in fire. That's just the way it is going to be. So let us continue in and see what happens. Kol kovel dena. Bazimna kedish hamein kol hamemaya kalkalna. And so it was that at the moment that all the nations heard the trumpets, Mastrokita, Katros, the names of the different musical instruments, Sabecha, Pesanterin, Bechol Zene Zemara. They heard the entire orchestra. Nafelin, Kol HaMemaya, all the nations, Umaya Velishanaya, they all fell down on the ground before the idol, Sagedin, and they worshipped Leselem Dahava. They worshipped this obelisk that Nebuchadnezzar put in Bik'at Dura, Dihakem Nebuchadnezzar Makkah. So they were very compliant. But not everybody was compliant. Because you know who was there? Among the ministers of the government, who were appointed as ministers of government? Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They are also government officials. So they were there. They did not bow down. And it's very obvious when you're, when everybody's bowing down and you're not, it's just very obvious. You stick out like a sore thumb. My father and my mom, who's here by the way, and I think this took place in Barcelona. Was it Barcelona? So it took place in Barcelona where they were, it was a Sunday morning, the streets were quiet. And tell me if I say something wrong, since I'm just like repeating from the memory of hearing the story from Daddy. But they were in the streets of Barcelona. This is back in the 50s, 60s, early 60s? Early 60s, and everything was quiet, the park was quiet. Where was everybody? It was Sunday morning, but still everything was very, very quiet, eerily quiet. And then they see a procession coming with Yamach Shema V'Zichra, Mary, right? And it was a consecration ceremony. And they were coming to the local church with the new Avodah Zarah to enter the church with this Avodah Zarah. And what they did is, and my parents were walking in the park, and suddenly the parade came to the park where they were in, and everybody was there. Hundreds of people. In the middle were the bishops, the various clothing, and with the crosses. And there was the statue of Yamach Shema V'Zichra, right, the virgin who somehow gave birth to. The whole thing is just so weird and just creepy. I mean, it's like one of these weird movies that you just want to see because you don't want to, have nightmares at night. But somehow this virgin gave birth to this baby who somehow didn't need his diapers changed because he was the savior of humanity. Actually, it's a machloket. They have a big machloket. Did he need diaper change? Did he need a big machloket? We don't have machloket like that, thank God, in the Gemara. Baruch Hashem. So they can all breathe easy. Anyway, they came into the middle of the park, and suddenly, at the instruction of the father, whoever he was, everybody bowed down to the idol. Right? That was part of the consecration ceremony. Before you bring it into the church, they're all bowing down into the idol. And my mom was there, my father was there, and they stood straight. They, of course, refused to bow down. What? Scared to death. You were scared. I think Daddy was probably enjoying himself. I know Daddy. But my father tells, what?
We were walking and then we saw beautiful like flowers on the floor. And we came closer to see what it's all about. Like we didn't know. And all of a sudden.
Then they came. The procession came, with little children probably holding the crosses and the whole thing. Yeah. Anyway, so everybody bowed down, and my father tells me that when they refused to bow down, they were standing. Everyone's like looking at them, like what is wrong with you? So every time I read this story, I think every time I read this story in the book of Daniel, I think of the story that my parents tell me when they were in Barcelona in the 60s, because it's a similar type of psychology, and the psychology of Avodah Zarah. We can talk about that, but I see it's end of the day. So I think what I like to do now is as follows. First of all, are there any questions? Actually, you know what? Let's do one more pasuk. Let's do one more pasuk, okay? We'll do one more pasuk, and then I want to connect it with the Parashat HaShavua, and then if there's any questions, we'll take questions. All right. Kol kobel dena bezimna keribu gubrin chasta'in. Immediately after people bow down and pray to the idol, the Chaldeans hated the Jews. By the way, when Nebuchadnezzar wanted to destroy Jerusalem, he sent the Chaldeans into Jerusalem because they were vicious, they hated Jews, and they were happy to do the dirty work for the Babylonian king. So these Chaldeans were there, and they decided to slander those Jews, because as we said, there was 3 Jews there, Hananiah, Mishael, Ba'azareh, who did not bow down before the idol, and they saw it, and they immediately go to Nebuchadnezzar to tattletale on these Jews because they did not bow down. And they said, Ano ve'amerin, de Nebuchadnezzar Malka, and they said, Your Majesty, Malka le'alemin chayi, may you live eternally. Ant Malka, you, O King, Samta ta'em, you made a law, and the law was, Dichol enash, any person, Dishma kal karna mashorokita toros sabecha tesanterin vesuponya vechozene zemara. Any person who hears these musical instruments, the orchestra, must immediately, Yipel ve'iskud leselim dahava, must bow down before the golden obelisk. You said so. There was instructions that came from you. Uman dilai pe ve'iskud. But if somebody refuses, the penalty yitremeh lero'atun nura yakidita will be thrown into a pit of fire. Didn't you say that? Isn't that the rule that you said? Of course, the answer is yes. And this brings us to another point about tyranny. Tyrants love to talk about democracy. They love that. They love to talk about rights. How people, well, you know, the Russians, the communists had the Bill of Rights for the Russians, right? Everybody talks about freedom. You think it's like a big chidush, oh, we believe in freedom? I mean, America actually instituted freedom for the people, right? But everybody talks about freedom. The difference is some countries institute and some countries don't, right? So in America, there was freedom for many, many years, right? Anyway, so the Russians had that, right? So for a tyranny, you need to have a state symbol. Let's call it the obelisk in this case. You need to have the threat of violence. In this case, thrown into the pit of fire. But you know what you need most of all for a tyranny to function? What is it that the tyrant needs? He needs collaboration. He needs people to snitch on each other. If you don't have people snitching on each other, the tyrant can't do it. By the way, in Australia, when they had the COVID lockdowns, one of the rules that the government put out is if you see somebody violating one of the lockdowns, you must inform the authorities. That's typical tyranny. Typical tyranny. I think they probably had some other things in Canada. I'm not. What? Well, they have that here too, where they tell them to snitch. Interesting. That's very interesting because, the Gulag Archipelago, one of the great, great masterpieces of the 20th century, Solzhenitsyn, and I quote that book so many times. I think I quoted it just 2 weeks ago. He says how the Russian authorities they needed people to snitch on each other. It was encouraged. So people, for example, let me tell you the way it worked. So let's say people didn't have their own houses. People, they would cram several families into one apartment building. So every family would get like a small room, like 5 beds in the room, whatever. And of course, if you're in that apartment building, it's very hard. You have to share the bathroom, you have to share the shower, you have to share the kitchen, terrible conditions, right? So that's the way it was. Now, if you wanted the whole apartment, so what would you do? You would snitch on the other family. And it was very common. It was very common. So you snitch on the other family, they said something bad about Lenin. Oh, okay. They come, take the people, send them to Siberia, and as a reward for snitching, you now get the whole apartment. Right? So this is typical modus operandi for tyrants. This is what Nebuchadnezzar is relying on. So these Chaldeans, they're snitching about the Jews. Dictators love that because it's only by having the simple people collaborate with the tyrant that gives the tyrant the maximum power. So you see the idea here. This is a beautiful book because it really takes you into the heart of these political systems, these tyrannical political systems. It tells you how it works. It tells you what the king is thinking, what the tyrant is thinking, how his mind works, what scares him, what gets him going. I want to stop here. I just want to, we have like literally 2 minutes, so maybe even less. But the best example is this week's parasha. In this week's parasha, when Paro has a dream, he says, "Hine omed al hayod," he was above the Nile River. That's what he sees in the dream. So what he actually sees, he sees himself al hayod. He sees himself above the Yaor. But when he describes the dream, when he repeats the dream, he doesn't say, "Hineni omed al hayod." What does he say? "Hineni omed al sefat hayod." I was standing by the bank of the river, not above the river, by the bank of the river. That tells you all you need to know. The river was a deity. The Nile was one of the great, powerful gods in Egypt. For Paro to say I was above the Nile River is blasphemy, right? You're saying that you're a god, right? I mean, he was a deity, but he wasn't above the Nile River. He said, so when he speaks to the people, what does he say? I was standing by the banks of the river, right? I don't view myself as a god. No, not at all. I'm a simple person just like everybody else in this room, right? That's what he's trying to portray himself. But the truth of the matter is, he really did view himself as a god because tyrants, dictators, most politicians today, they think they're better than us. Maybe they don't view themselves in theological terms, okay? But they think they're better. They think they're gods. They'll tell you and you what's good for you. They'll tell you what you should do with your life. They'll tell you how much taxes you should pay, what medicines to put in yourself, what they should teach your kids in school, transgenderism and all the other shachvat. So they know better than us. That's Paro. Hineni omed al hayod. But no, we're the same. We're all equal. He's not going to say I was above the Yaor. Aval sefata Yaor, right? But don't follow Paro. See what happens to you, right? There are consequences. That's the way these dictatorships work. Beautiful connection between Perashat HaShavua, the psychology of Nebuchadnezzar, and the holiday of Hanukkah, all tied up in this one class. Any questions? If not, shut the thing. All right, gentlemen. All right. Questions? Yeah? No? All right.
Is Danielle in the sea?
I'm sorry?
Is Danielle there?
So that's a great question. What happened to Daniel? Because Daniel himself was a god. You remember how Nebuchadnezzar brought korbanot to him? He's exempt. Gods don't have to worship other gods, right? He's a deity. So you can't tell one deity to worship another. That would be unreasonable. That's why he was out of the story.
How did he accept it?
Oh, he didn't. The Chachamim said that the minute Nebuchadnezzar wanted to bring korbanot, he says, don't do this. But in Nebuchadnezzar's mind, he viewed Daniel as a god because he had the power to enter and penetrate his thoughts. So he realized, Okay? Gentlemen, pleasure to be here. Always a pleasure to be in the Torah. And next class, we'll see you. We'll all get your